do you think this non-absolutism was allowed? I mean, if I was an absolute monarch, why would I allow judges to tell me that I couldn't put this Robin Hood in jail or whatever? I mean, it seems like it again. It seems another interesting feature of the Anglosphere that somehow absolutism is not even the Lord is above the monarch in some respects, in a way that isn't in continental Europe and it isn't in China and Japan. And how's
Well,
that happened?
well, it's absolutely the case. In absolutist systems, the king is the source of law.
Hmm.
In England, we have, it's admittedly a fiction, but it's a very important fiction, that the crown is under the law.
Yeah.
There is the law, there is the crown, there are the people. Now, what is that law? Well, it's very nebulous, but there is some higher authority, which is the legal system, and it is independent. And the reason for that is that the Anglo-Saxon system of traveling justices, there was not a very powerful royal power at that time.
Hmm.
And you had pretty independent farmers. It's described by Tacitus and others, independent farming families, um, and a fragmented kinship system. And the law was preserved by traveling magistrates, as it were, who went from village to village. That was
So is
quite,
this a bit like what Gellner was saying when he said that one of the things about England is that none of the sources of an absolutism were able to defeat the other ones, and so it was kind of relatively weak. Everything was kind of relatively weak compared to everything else, and so nobody could dominate. And that was the way that we managed to sneak in the kind of systems that you're talking about.
well, it's exactly that.
Yeah.
Um, it's a balance of forces,
Mm.
the uh, which was from the in Anglo-Saxon and in Carolingian Europe. That is from 5th to the 10th, 11th, 12th century. This is quite widespread. You would have found a similar system in France and Spain and so on for half a millennium.
Right.
A balance between the political power, and the political power was distributed between different organizations. There was the crown or the king, there were the nobles, there were the towns and cities, which were quite independent, and there was the clergy. And those four, and then quite powerful bourgeois and traders and so on, those were all roughly equal in power. And what happened um, in over all of Europe is that the balance tilted from about the 12th century, and this is what Maitland and others describe. And from about the 12th century, the power of the crown and the church, and they entered into what Gilman talks about, a sort of pact between a Caesaro-papist pact, Caesar and the papacy, joined together. So this pact then came to dominate the others. They extinguished the power of the cities to a large extent, took away their powers, and they subdued the nobility, which became underneath the crown. That happened all over Europe between the 12th and the 15th centuries. And it was the same time that this Justinian Roman law filtered back in and gave a justification to the crown. Now, why didn't it happen in England? The question is turned on its head. The normal course of history, and you would find it in great empires in anywhere around the world, why didn't it happen? And the simple single word answer, I suppose, is islandhood. England is an island. And this had a strange effect because the way in which the crown usually got the nobility and the cities to accept its domination was through the threat of war. So what characteristically happened was that the King of France would go to the nobility, and particularly the ones on the edges, and say, you know, if you don't come to my court and pay obeisance to me and do what I tell you, I'll let the King of Spain have your land. I won't defend you in the next invasion. So each time there is a war between these nation states on the continent, you get, and the other part of it is that in order to defend yourself against these invading Spaniards or whoever, you need to have a standing army. And a standing army is more or less identical with dictatorship. As soon as you have a crown or royal power which has paid troops in their hundreds of thousands, which can come and destroy your village or do whatever it likes, then the individual cities or citizens are extremely vulnerable. Now in England, apart from the Scots, who were a bit of a trial, but you had some local defences against them and so on, you dealt with the Welsh. The Irish were across the sea. The Scots, from time to time, you needed to defend yourself. But the weakness of the army against the Scots is shown by the fact that in 1715 and 1745, the Scots, with very small and ragtag armies, more or less came down and took England in 1715. I mean, there was there was no standing army. Now, the second effect of not having a standing army, each is a kind of link in a chain. This is how history works, links and chains, because if you don't have if you have a standing army, you have to have a high taxation. How do you pay for this army? So the way you pay for it is extorting money from your populace, either directly by, you know, putting huge taxes or whatever, or sending the army out, as was characteristic around Europe, to live off the people. So you would suddenly find a regiment had turned up on your doorstep and taken all your chickens and grain and so on for a few weeks and then moved on. So basically, in England, this wealthy, strong, urban set, the bourgeois, the people in York and Canterbury and London, the city of London and so on, the wealthy independent church of England, the powerful but not too powerful feudal nobility distributed around the country, and the amazingly large and prosperous middle class of England, which is a very old feature of England. Each of them had enough power so that they, from time to time, when they got uppity kings, they would tell them where to get off, either cut off their heads or produce a Magna Carta and stipulate their rights or whatever, so that the balance never tilted. And it's nothing to do with the great moral character of the English. It's their good fortune in having the sea around them.